Alrighty, well, Representative Andy Menz, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
I appreciate that. So if you don't mind beginning by giving some of your background and some of your work you've been doing recently.
Yeah, so I am the state representative for House District 45, that's East Norman. So I have some of the urban area, but I also have half of Lake Thunderbird, so I have a large rural area in my district as well. So I often say it's kind of like I represent two different sensibilities, so it's like two different districts, but I feel pretty uniquely qualified to be able to do that just because of my personal upbringing and experiences. So I grew up here in Oklahoma. I graduated from Putnam City West High School, so that's West OKC. And I moved around a lot just because I lived with grandparents, with my dad for a while, with my mom for a while. I have 5 siblings. We were kind of bounced around a lot while our parents were going through things, and we struggled a lot financially. And so I know what it's like to struggle to make ends meet, to have to put things back on the shelf at the grocery store. I know what it's like to be a free lunch kid, to rely on teachers for a lot of things, and friends' parents for a lot of things. And I know a lot of folks in my district could say the same or similar stories. And I've also been privileged to finish school and pursue a secondary degree, and I enlisted in the military. I served my country. I was able to utilize programs available to Americans and work hard. And I served before I ran for this office. I worked here in this building for like 7 years on the nonpartisan staff side. So I ran a legislative office here on the House side for 2 members, and then I was an assistant for Senator Michael Brooks of South Oklahoma City for 5 years over in the Senate. And then he kind of kicked me out of the nest and said, "You go run now." So now here I am. But I see myself in a lot in my district, the people of my district, my constituents, and luckily they see a lot of themselves in me too, and they sent me here to represent them. And so when I talk about how there are just kind of different sensibilities, I don't feel like, or at least I haven't seen that they're conflicting in my district. They're very they're all just such good neighbors. I mean, Norman is such a great town. But yeah, I mean, that's a little bit of my background, a little bit of what I'm doing here, and how I got here.
Cool. And when did you take office?
2022.
Okay, gotcha. And so you've mentioned some of your background leading up to this. What particularly about getting into public office appealed to you?
So when I was elected, I was the first Latina elected to the Oklahoma State House of Representatives in state history, and the first woman veteran elected to the state legislature. So the representation, I mean, I have nieces, I have dear friends with daughters who are like nieces, and I wanted them to have somebody who looked like them, someone that they looked up to. I always say when I go speak to student groups, if you're pursuing a passion in a certain field of work and you look around for a mentor in that field of work and you don't see anybody who looks like you have the obligation to become that person. And that was part of the Senator Brooks kicking me out of the nest thing. Like, hey, it's your turn now. You have to go and set this standard and set this example, and work hard and do it. And so providing the extra levels of representation, that was one of the big reasons why I was called to do this from a very early age. I mean, this is something that's something that God put on my heart a long time ago. specifically in 2022, I always say the reasons I decided that was the time were two reasons, two T's: teachers and turnpike. So education and transportation are the two biggest issues in my district. I was here on staff during the teacher walkout, the most recent one, and hundreds of teachers from all over the state visited Senator Brooks's office, and he met with all of them. And I mean, if he was in the office, he was meeting with them that week and a half that was going on. And it was amazing, because it was like the people who are usually downtrodden in this building were rock stars those 2 weeks. I mean, like, it was so cool. But every teacher that came in, you know, if Senator Brooks wasn't there, they would leave their message with me. And not one of them talked about their own pay. I mean, they would talk about how they were using their personal funds to supplement supplies and stuff, or snacks or whatever for kids in their class. But they weren't, none of them asked for higher pay. They were asking for smaller class sizes. They were asking for more funding for their classrooms, for their kids. So I feel like there was this disconnect from what we were seeing, what we were being presented with, you know, in the media, in the PR sphere, that this was about teacher pay raise. And then we saw Governor Fallon telling them to get back in the classroom, and people like the backlash. But the thing is that the actual classroom teachers that were coming in, and we had support staff too coming in to the offices advocating for more funding for the schools for their kids. And they called them their kids, because I mean, they are. And so, I mean, that's something that I always carried with me. And then just seeing the way that the rhetoric was going and things that were happening. I mean, like I said, I grew up in West OKC, product of public schools myself. I have a 13-year-old son, but he had been going to a charter school here in Oklahoma City, because I worked at the Capitol. I lived right down the street, and we put him in a STEM-based school, and I mean, he was doing great, but we knew that we wanted him to go to public school, and Norman has great public schools. They have a great public school system. Is it perfect? No, none of them are, but Norman is amazing. And so we moved down there. He's been in Norman Public Schools and is flourishing. And in 2022, I just kind of started to realize that, you know, this is not going in a good direction with as far as the rhetoric was going. You know, there were things happening in other states that oftentimes we see replicated in Oklahoma, and so I was really fired up. I'm not an educator. I've never been a teacher. During the quarantine, when we were doing distance learning, that was hard. That was hard. I mean, I wanted to buy my son's teachers each like a car or something for all of the, oh my goodness, like, bless their hearts. I couldn't do it. I can't, but, and I just have the one. I mean, I don't know how they do it with like 36-year-olds in a classroom. I just couldn't. I mean, I love kids, but it's a lot. And so, I mean, there are people up here fighting for teachers and educators and support staff, but not enough.
Sure.
And so that lit a fire under me. And then the final straw that broke the camel's back was that turnpike in my district. It was proposed to go right up the middle of my district. And like, I mean, within hours, we had a coalition of neighbors banding together. And I went with my friend Jacob Rosecrans. I was helping him out on his campaign at the time. And because I've done some consulting work here and there, very light. I mean, not a big consultant by any means, but so I'd gone with him to walk through this neighborhood out in the eastern part of my district. And it's off the beaten path, but it's definitely a neighborhood. I mean, beautiful houses, people, they know each other. So they had like a little lemonade stand, the news crews were out there. I saw Norman leaders from different parties, shoulder to shoulder, walking through this neighborhood with these neighbors. learning about their family histories and how long they've been in this neighborhood. And I saw like an Asian pear orchard and like, pets are buried there. And these are people who Governor Stitt called rooftops. There's just rooftops. It's just farmland out there. But it's not. These are people in homes, and it's their property and memories, and just the use of eminent domain for another toll road nobody wants is oppressive. And we're still in that battle now. But I think that was the last straw for me, because like I said, having worked up here for so many years, the bulk of what I do still, or what I've always done, has been constituent casework. That's not something that we trumpet a whole lot, because there are privacy issues. So if somebody calls in, say you have an issue with like the tax commission or something, you call the assistant in the office of your state legislator and you give them the rundown of what's going on with your issue, and if we can help, we reach out to the tax commission. If it's not like a legal problem or whatever, like we can liaise with those state agencies to cut red tape and make sure that you get taken care of. And that's probably my favorite part about working in this building is, when someone calls up here, they've exhausted most all of their options. They've tried to do everything on their own, so they get fired up. I'm calling my senator, I'm calling my representative. So they have been given the runaround, and the buck has to stop somewhere. I'm totally fine with the buck stopping here. And so when they call, I want to be able to pick up that phone and help them. And the communication aspect is key. Building that bridge, building a strong line of communication with people that you represent is this job. Like consent of the governed, right? So the Oklahoma Turnpike Authority is made up of unelected bureaucrats, and a lot of these people out in my district found out they were losing their homes on Facebook.
Wow. Having
worked here so long, I know there are better ways to talk to people. I know there are better ways to contact constituents. Norman kind of gets a bad rap with some folks across the state because, they think that we're rabble rousers, but in reality, we are dialed in and we just want to be part of the conversation. We just want to be part of the conversation. And when we're not, you're going to hear about it. We're going to get upset, and you're going to hear about it, So yeah, after taking a stroll through that neighborhood with Jacob and them, it was a real turning point for me. And then Representative Bell, who had this seat before I did, it was that same week, I think, or maybe if the following week, she had called me into her office and told me that she wasn't running again, and that I was the only person she was asking, because I've been up here, and I thought, had she asked me before I took that walk through that neighborhood, I don't know. This is something I feel like has been it's been put in my path before. I've had legislators tell me that they want me to run soon or run for their seat when they term out or whatever. But this was the first one that was like, all the chips were in the right place. They felt, so it was a good opportunity at the right time. But gosh, with everything that was going on, yeah, those are the two things that just really were like, no, there's no other option. You have got to do this now. So here I am.
Cool. And you said a few things I do want to expand on. In particular, you mentioned the idea of rhetoric at a different level, at the national level in other states, that gets replicated in terms of reactionary policy here, and also the some issues with our schools. But before we go into that, you alluded to the idea that you had wanted to serve in public office for a very long time. Was there anything in particular that made you interested in that from a young age, or?
I try to pinpoint that sometimes, because I know I had been concerned about my teachers in middle school, just kind of seeing them struggle with getting all the kids under control and, paying for things on their own. And I remember thinking, like, 6th or 7th grade, like, why is that a thing? Whose fault is that? You know? And so that's kind of what piqued my interest in law, I guess. But it wasn't super specific to government or policy until high school. And in high school, I started, taking honors classes and AP classes and learning a little bit more about the way things work on the government side and all of that. And then I started volunteering with candidates. The first time I knocked door for a campaign was for Brad Carson when he ran for U.S. Senate, and that was in 2004. That was 20 years ago. And it was before I was old enough to vote. Yeah, so I've been knocking doors for 20 years for people. I mean, yeah, so it's different whenever you're knocking for yourself, but yeah, it's, yeah.
Okay, so interesting. So that thread of education influencing your interest has been persistent. And so you mentioned that your son you had in a charter school. It was Dove Science Academy, right?
Dove.
That's right. That was also the high school I went to.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah.
I didn't know that.
So why did you view public schools in Norman as preferable?
I mean, for me, it wasn't necessarily that it was a norm, and I think, like, specifically in Oklahoma City, I think charter schools are kind of starting more to veer into what's viewed as the norm overall. I mean, whether that's good or not, I don't know. I think that I don't have any of Oklahoma City public schools in my district. But for me and my family specifically, we had looked into doing private school. I mean, this was before he was born. We were just kind of trying to figure out the best options around, and we wanted him to have a really good science foundation. And he's been talking about being an engineer since like 3rd grade. I mean, he still does. Now he just can't nail down which kind of engineer he wants to be. So, I mean, I think just for our family, just knowing that his dad also went to public school in a very, very small town, but it was a great school. It still is. And then so did I, and mine was substantially bigger than the one his dad went to. But I think we wanted a wider variety of experiences for him. We loved Dove. I mean, the teachers and the administration, I mean, they really care about the kids. But we wanted kind of a little bit more of a classic situation, you know, with sports teams and music programs, and, you know, he rides the bus, and we just kind of wanted him to have that experience as well. He's a drummer, so yeah, he's been taking private lessons for a few years, but now that he's in middle school, they have a band program, and I mean, the district, it's Norman, so the music programs are top notch. It's a music town for sure. It's an arts town, really. So they take it very seriously down there. And so yeah, he gets to do band, and he wouldn't be able to do that at Dove. So every once in a while, he probably like the first 2 years he was at Norman Public Schools, he would mention Dove. But he still keeps in contact with some of his friends from elementary school. Yeah, he has good memories from Dove.
Okay, that's good. And as you mentioned, increasingly, especially in Oklahoma City, charter schools are becoming the norm, in part because our public schools are just so lacking in funding and resources, like huge class sizes and these things. And so that is, I mean, a persistent problem in the state generally, right? Especially now that we're under the auspices of Ryan Walters, who most famously recently is trying to push a Bible mandate and stuff like that. I mean, was any of that a concern to you, that being in public schools, more of the state would have an influence than over charter school? At least presumably. I mean, I don't know exactly how these things are administered, how much charter schools are independent from the school level, but was that at all a concern for you?
Not really. I mean, not at the time. I mean, and even now, I mean, Norman Public Schools was the first district to come out and say, no, we're not doing that Bible thing. No, no thanks. And then myself and Representatives Deck and Rosecrans put out a statement to support them. Like, yeah, don't. And thank you for fighting for our kids. I mean, like I said, I mean, obviously I'm biased, but Norman Public Schools is where it's at.
Right. And that in that particular case of the Bible mandate, that sort of does have echoes to what's going on in other states as well. For example, Louisiana that had the mandate of putting up the 10 Commandments, and this, again, is something you alluded to, the idea of different policies that come up. In this most recent session, probably the biggest example of this would be HB 4156, right, which is largely a response to Texas's S4 bill and a few other anti-immigration pieces of legislation. So if you could break down what these things are and what your kind of work with respect to them has been.
Right, and so this is something that we can talk about for days because I mean it's still ongoing.
Sure.
This is the number one issue for a certain portion of our country, a certain like high voter turnout portion of our country. So obviously it's going to be a main topic. And so every election year we have the general election in May, but we also have primaries in June usually. And so a lot of the members in the legislature knew that they were facing primaries. So they were trying to get ahead of any messaging to their constituents on this specific issue. Constituents who they believe all want this change. I guarantee you that there's no House district in the state of Oklahoma that is 100% on board with that bill. It just isn't. There's just no way. And the only way that you can properly, I believe, represent your entire district, not just the loudest ones, the whole district, is by going out and talking to them. Town halls, knock doors. Okay? They invite you to church, go to church with them. You don't have to change your entire belief structure, just go sit with these people and listen. That's the other key. You know, like you want to go and talk to people and stand there and just yap, but like don't. Just listen, you know? So rather than doing all of that, because that's hard and expensive and time, you know, consuming, we'll just file these big flashy bills and issue a bunch of different press releases and maybe have a press conference, do all kinds of stuff all over social media. We'll send out mail pieces. We'll just hit everybody with mail. That way we don't actually have to listen. We don't have to listen to them. They don't have to hear their thoughts or how they felt when they saw that piece of mail. You know, this is the show that we're putting on because we have a primary coming up and we have to outflank this person who's decided to come and try to steal the seat from me in my own party. So I have to out-party that person, you know? And who cares if several hundred people are traumatized by this? Thousands, actually, are traumatized by this. Who cares if this affects, you know, the labor market and workforce and every aspect of American life, really?
I think it is worth spelling out what it is, though. So you mentioned some of the pressures behind what you believe the authors that wrote the bill had in mind, but so the bill would create the crime of impermissible occupation, right? Basically making that anybody who's not documented is committing some kind of crime. The first offense would be a misdemeanor, the second would be a felony. And so this, to give more context for why it's such a controversial bill, in part is because the federal government has the purview to decide immigration policy, and so this would be the state directly intervening, but also it would be the state intervening on what municipalities could do, because within the bill, it basically made it so that you can't have sanctuary cities, you can't have any of that sort of policy. And essentially what this would do is it's an attempt to have sort of Trumpian immigration policy at a state level. So that was one of the goals behind it, was to get national attention behind it, to drum up, as you mentioned, support for the primaries.
Sure.
But if you could detail some of the work you and your colleagues have been doing to work against this bill.
Right, and so working against it involves understanding why it's there in the first place, just what's the motivation here. So, you mentioned that the intent was to gain national attention, sure. The intent was to ban sanctuary cities and all of this. I've maintained that they didn't actually want to do any of it. There were some of them who actually believed in what they were doing and wanted to do it. Why do you think it took the governor so long to sign it? He didn't want to. He really didn't want to sign it. We could tell. It was pretty obvious. And with all the work that he's been doing to outreach to the Latino community in Oklahoma, this is by far, like the first governor to do this much work in the Latino community in Oklahoma. He's been very intentional about that. And he's still a dude at the end of the day, he's still just a man. He has a conscience. He knows that he's gone around to small businesses in the Latino communities and met with families, and he puts a face to this bill that comes to his desk, and it sat there, and he didn't want to sign it. Even when they were presenting it, it was lackluster. They got the most eloquent speaker in their entire caucus to present the bill, and he tripped up a lot.
On the House side or?
On the House side. He tripped up a lot, more than I've seen him. And this guy, he's not stupid. One of the most brilliant minds that's ever served in this legislature, but just wasn't his best. He wasn't his best that day. And so that was part of our strategy to fight it, was just kind of, first of all, accepting the premise that there is an issue with immigration policy in this country. But also, again, just reminding them that this is largely a federal issue. Okay, and so you couple those two things together, because there's no way you can argue against them. They're facts. I believe in my debate, I even said, I know that the presidential administration right now, the Biden administration, has failed on this issue. I said that about the Obama administration too. And of course the Trump administration isn't great either. So I don't have a problem going against the grain whenever I know I'm right. They expected us to get up and present this full-throated defense of any Democrat walking, and they expected us to get up and advocate for open borders and all this stuff. None of that happened. And that was stunning to them, because they really wanted the sound bites, again, for their primaries. They wanted the show. Some of them actually really believed in this bill. They really wanted this to happen. So for those folk, we thought, okay, if you want to do something real, we have options. Latino Caucus has options. I filed an amendment to it. Rep. Alonso filed an amendment to it. We tried to offer to make the bill a little bit better. And I know Senator Brooks had some ideas over in the Senate as well to try and adjust it. But they would have none of it. And it was, at the end of the day, if they weren't going to be affable to trying to make something lasting and real policy-wise, then our amendments just ended up being part of the show, right? But that was a choice that they made. We gave them that choice and they made it. And so it was, I mean, it was difficult. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, getting up and debating that day, because this hearing on the House floor specifically was on the heels of me getting phone calls from my family, just like terrified, right? So for me to stand up and debate against it, knowing full well I'm right, knowing why they're doing this, and you know, it's hard not to get cynical in this building with people, but there are a couple of folks down there, I think at least two, that legitimately broke my heart with their vote that day. One of them didn't win his primary. He made that vote. I thought, you know, shitting on immigrants and picking on Mexicans was supposed to save them in their primaries, but it didn't. It didn't even work. They put all of that effort and all of that fight into this sure thing that was supposed to help them gain political points, and they traumatized thousands of people, and they didn't care, and it didn't even work.
Right. And so you mentioned one or two people broke your heart in this. I'm assuming the second would have been the fourth member of the Latino caucus, Jessica Garvin, who also lost her election.
That was upsetting. Yeah, that was pretty upsetting. I was specifically referring to House members, but yeah, her too. I mean, that was. I felt for her. I really did. I mean, she is someone who I would consider a friend. She was the only other Latina in the legislature, so I mean, there was that. But
and the only Republican Hispanic member of the Congress, right, in all Congress of our state.
Yeah, and so it was tough seeing her. I mean, it was just this desperation of trying to appeal to the far right in her district, but I mean, and no disrespect to her, but I think she and a lot of our, you know, Latino friends who are identifying more conservative, one thing that they always forget, there's no amount of money that you'll ever make. There's no amount of putting yourself down or your family down or your friends down. There's no amount of success you can achieve that will make them like you. That's it. There's nothing. So you might as well get up, if you're going to get up, and fight for something that's right.
Right. And I do want to go back to a point. You made an interesting point there. It sounds like you don't think the authors of the bill or many of the proponents of the bill actually necessarily wanted to. They sort of more like they wanted a reaction.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because the process by which it was done was so sped up. It was so last minute. It didn't go through the normal process of legislation. It went through committees, debate, having a process by which it's like updated. And so actually one of the saving graces of the story is that it was so rushed through, that it's so poorly written, so like patently unconstitutional, and there's no mechanism for creating an infrastructure to carry it out even if it did become law. So it's like one of the saving graces of it seems to be that it was written so poorly as to be unconstitutional and unenforceable in some ways. So it seems like almost the point wasn't to get it into law effectively, rather just to get the, you know, as you mentioned, the talking points.
That's correct. So I don't know if I would call it a saving grace. I think I would call it the actual intent. Because you remember who wrote it, right? Who
McCall and Treat Drummond asked for it, but did he author the
Drummond is the one that like put together the language. That's what I was told, and that's what and he was the one claiming victory on it before we even started the debate. I mean, he put out a press release that hit my inbox before the time on the clock started during that bill.
Wow.
called my caucus the Open Borders Caucus, and literally none of us said anything like that. That's what tells you, I mean, that it was dropped in, that it was written. Governor Drummond is not stupid. In fact, he is incredibly brilliant. I mean, he is one of the shrewdest legal minds of a generation. He knows how to write law. This was not intended to become law. And it wasn't intended for our reaction. It wasn't intended for the legislature's reaction. It was intended for the Biden administration's action, their reaction. And they got it. Whenever the feds issued the injunction, they got it. That was their Christmas in May. That's what they wanted. The whole thing. That's what it was for from the beginning. So, I mean, again, who cares if it hurts people, you know? They didn't come here to represent those people, did they? So yeah, I mean, that was the real intent of the bill, was to get that kind of reaction, so that then we could see them do laps on Twitter and send out a couple more of those mail pieces. Look, I'm fighting the Biden administration.
So that's interesting.
In a fight that they picked, you know?
Yes, yeah. That's interesting. I mean, what do you think the relevance was? So when Drummond asked for it, he specifically attempted to single out illegal marijuana grows, which, I mean, it's kind of a redundant thing if it's illegal. I mean, now that's already against the law. And so, but I mean, one of the things, so when I read his press release asking for it, one of the things that struck me is he specifically observed that he wanted to target, quote, Chinese and Mexican nationals. And that definitely sounds much more of that rhetoric that was.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, so do you think that angle, the illegal medical marijuana grow angle, was part of this broader goal of getting a reaction from Biden, or was that just incidental?
I don't think that was incidental. I think it was a dog whistle for our friends in the rural parts of the state. I think that was put in there just for them, that messaging.
How so?
Well, instead of working to expand mental health care access in the rural reaches, or health care in general, instead of working to improve the rural school districts or the infrastructure in the rural parts of the state, to earn people's votes that way, sometimes it's easier for folks to give them a boogeyman to fight against. And a large portion of our folk out in rural Oklahoma are farmers. So you pick an agriculture thing that feels threatening to them, you know. And a lot of them, I mean, we saw the way that the recreational marijuana, or the adult use marijuana state question, went down in the rural parts of the state. So it's a pretty good gauge of how they feel about it. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, its intent was to manipulate a certain group.
Okay. And so, two things you had mentioned previously was that this is an ongoing issue. And you also mentioned that you and your colleagues had proposed some amendments to the bill. Is there any talk among you and your colleagues about presenting your amendments again this next coming session to try and have a more substantive? Because that was one of the things that you and your colleagues mentioned, the idea of, you know, if you're going to pass an immigration bill, you can be, you know, one of the first of its kind in the state to have, you know, bipartisan support. If you were to have an amendment process where you can have a real substantive process, one of the specific recommendations that y'all had raised was allowing migrants to have driver's licenses. And this is something that Senator Brooks has been working on for a time. So are y'all in talks at all about doing that for the next session, or what is the progress on that front?
So we have been traveling to legislative conferences in other states and meeting with our counterparts in other legislatures, other Latino elected legislators, and gathering information. I know that the driver's license bill is not something that we're ever going to give up on, especially Senator Brooks. I was there at the inception of it whenever, I was working for him in his office, and that's something that he is very passionate about and that he made clear, like, this is why I'm here. And so that's something that we are going to be working on. And the policy that comes through this building is affected and sometimes driven by national politics and election outcomes. So depending on a lot of different factors, how we approach it is going to vary. Yes.
Okay. But is there any like concrete plan for reintroducing those things?
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet.
Okay. And so it is worth spelling out a bit why for the license is particular. So one of the things that would be done ideally would be that migrants who have is the ITIN number that they're
Yes.
able to pay pay taxes, but
Yes.
they're not able to receive the government funds. But
Right.
that is a form of identification.
Right.
And the idea being that if they were to have licenses, this would bring insurance costs down, this would make driving safer, this would be, for going to school, for going to work, etc. But also, from the angle of the people concerned about illegal immigration, this would be a very powerful tool for law enforcement. One of the concerns that has been raised by law enforcement officials with migrants in particular are ones that don't have any form of documentation, called ghost criminals, when they're not able to track in any way. And so the driver's license registry was one of the largest, maybe the largest law enforcement registry in the country. And so that would be one way that you could have more safety in terms of immigration policy as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Linking it to taxpayer status that was and is the best way with the best possible outcomes for Oklahoma. Because not only, like you said, would it be a fantastic tool for law enforcement and for insurance, but it would generate revenue. And a large portion of the revenue would go to public safety, funding police. And it had, of course, the potential to create new taxpayers, which would boost revenue as well. When we were going through different statistics to form our arguments against 4156, we found that, and this is state of Oklahoma numbers, folks with those I-10 numbers, immigrants with those I-10 numbers, paid over $26 million in income tax alone last year. Just income tax. That's not sales tax or any of the other taxes we have. Just income tax. So that was one of my questions. This bill is like $1 billion joke y'all just made. I said, do any of you have $26 million that you can fill that hole with? Cut the check to the tax commission if you do. If you're gonna send all of those people out of the state and deport them, mass deportation, who's paying for that? It's $1 billion joke you just made.
Yeah, and it's also relevant that those considerations didn't come up in the budget process as well. At the end of session, it got extended because the debates around the budget were hard to resolve, but they weren't even accounting for if this bill became law. The loss of tax revenue and loss of industry, all sorts of different stuff. And the governor, and the governor maintained that he did not believe it would have any kind of fiscal impact. But as you mentioned, if it were to become law, if it were to be in effect, clearly it would, right? In addition to the revenue loss, also the cost of enforcing this would be a new cost, but also, just practically, right? Where would they go, right?
Sure.
Because so for example, Mexico has said that it won't accept any deported people other than from the federal government. So Oklahoma couldn't do it to Mexico or other states, presumably. So it's one of those things that even if it were to become law, it's just so impractical. It's unclear what they even were hoping to achieve with it, other than, as you mentioned,
political show. It's important to note the impact on law enforcement with this. So it was sold to us as another tool for law enforcement to use, but then law enforcement kind of banded together and said, we don't want this tool. It's not a good tool. Also, I mean, where's the funding for it coming from? There's no resources in the bill for like actual resources and funding for law enforcement to be able to do this. And a lot of them, I mean, they conveyed that this goes against their actual training. So it was important for us to kind of try and clarify and highlight that, which is what my amendment did. It was specifically just saying, if someone like me, I mean, I was born down the street here in Oklahoma City. If I'm pulled over and detained, and under this new law, and I'm charged with this, and I'm thrown in jail, and then later they realize, oh no, this is the U.S. citizen. We got the wrong gal. I would be able to then sue that law enforcement entity for damages, capped, but still, like, you can't just pull over brown people.
And the cap you suggested was $10,000, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and so one of the things that so if they were to become law and become effective, as you mentioned, right, this would just open the floodgates to racial profiling,
Sure.
right? 'Cause the idea of you just look illegal or something like that.
Right, and I didn't say that. Law enforcement said that.
Sure. And one of the things that the authors said was that this bill would target people in the commission of crimes, but there's nothing in the bill that says that, right? I mean, there's no...
Sure, and he also, in his debate, said that he would stand arm in arm with anyone who wants to use this bill for racial profiling. I mean, I'm still unclear on whether he misspoke, because again, he's like their most eloquent speaker, term and out. But, so, I mean, it was just so unclear. And whenever we're talking about the application and enforcement of the law, when we're putting law enforcement officers in danger every single day, we need clarity. We do not want things to be unclear. We don't want them to feel uncertain on something. So, for all of our chest beating up here about, back the blue and we support law enforcement, you can't support them unless you're listening to them. So yeah, that was something definitely to highlight about that bill.
Yeah, and so also relating to law enforcement, I mean, one of the big changes, if this were to become law, and this is something that I raised, so at the time I was working as a policy research intern. One of the things that struck me immediately when I first read the draft of this bill was this was just a big expansion of police powers, where it would give police effectively the opportunity to just demand papers from anybody they saw. Right? There was no provision in there that you have to be in the act of committing a crime, right? So if the police just wanted to check you for your papers, right, that would give them a whole new set of abilities to do so that otherwise they don't have, right? If you're not driving a car or doing something that otherwise you need some kind of license to do, the police don't have the right to just stop you and demand paperwork for you. And this would effectively give them that right. So that was another thing that struck me as well, that in addition to attempting to ostracize and alienate migrants, I mean, this for just ordinary citizens would also be a big expansion of police power that it doesn't seem that the authors considered, right? And I mean, but this would be a fundamental change in the relationship between the police and the citizens if it were to be put in effect. Alrighty, so another thing we talked about off camera was that you and the Latino Caucus are working with some efforts to increase the minimum wage. Could you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, so there's actually recently been a petition drive to get a state question on the ballot to increase the state's minimum wage. And so I believe they turned in way more than what they needed. So I imagine that's going to end up on the ballot. And excuse me, the Latino Caucus is supportive of that because, as we know, a lot of those lower paying minimum wage jobs are covered by folks in our community. And so just overall, we believe that, higher tides raise all ships. So getting good paying jobs, good quality jobs covered is a concern of many. not just the Latino caucus, but many folks in the legislature. Every time we hear an agency present on something, or we get budget requests and we have questions. I mean, workforce demands always come up. So I hosted an interim study last year on elder care, and that was one of the main issues is, the staff shortages in the workforce in some of our long-term care facilities in Oklahoma. I mean, we just aren't meeting the needs. And so bills like 4156 that are inflationary and would diminish the workforce, we need to pivot away from that kind of policy and look toward good solutions like raising the minimum wage that would help us bolster the workforce here. And so that's something that we've been talking about because we really, again, like I said, we want to get away from punitive things and get away from the mindset of punishing people and turn towards more incentive-based policy.
Sure. And so if that state question were to come up in the ballots, would be in the general election in November, or when would that come up if it did?
I mean, to me, it would make more sense to put it on the ballot in November.
Okay, gotcha.
So.
So anything else you want to say by way of wrapping up that topic of minimum wage?
Just that I know that it would help a lot of folks in my district.
Well, I do have a question actually. Yeah. So if the state question weren't successful, do you think the Latino caucus would push for a bill to increase the minimum wage?
I think so. Yeah. I know that members of the Oklahoma Legislative Black Caucus have filed that bill in the past. And that's something that that's something that I've been supportive of for sure. But I mean, we're hoping that the legislature and the elected leaders in Oklahoma take the people seriously. The initiative petition process is a real way for folks who, again, maybe are represented by people who don't knock on their door and don't go to the town halls and don't go and listen. So the petition process forces us to listen. And so we're really looking forward to supporting that.
And I know we're short on time here, we're about to wrap, but I made a personal commitment to myself that if I'm ever talking to a lawmaker, I have to raise the alarm flag about artificial intelligence. So I feel remiss if I didn't raise that here. So fortunately, our Third has been very receptive to a lot of the, raising the red flag. And he fortunately was one of the co-sponsors of the interim study on it. So I would just also suggest if there's any way you could become involved with sponsoring interim studies or any of these sorts of things. One of my big things is that the rate of change, the rate of development with artificial intelligence would just go faster and faster and become more and more complex. And the systems of government, the mechanisms of government are very slow and very cumbersome. So the quicker we get on the ball and build an infrastructure in terms of policy, in terms of lawmaking, in terms of regulation, the better, right? So I would just encourage you some food for thought to AI is a big red flag.
Oh yeah, it's definitely on my radar. I filed a bill this year that was specifically revenge porn related with AI. Just seeing the way that deepfake technology is moving so fast, and then we're coming into this election year. I mean, who knows what's going to be put out there by people who, and it's almost always going to be perpetrated toward women and minors. And so that's something that I've been pretty concerned with, and was able to have some really productive conversations across the aisle about. I mean, I think it's on a lot of folks' radar up here. But like you said, just the way that the law and policy moves is so much slower than the way technology moves. So.
And unfortunately, I mean, just conceptually, there's so many people that just don't quite grasp what artificial intelligence is. I mean, they just think of it as it's just another form of computer. I don't know what a computer is. It's not scary. But on the other end, too, I would also say there's a lot of signs of hope with artificial intelligence as well, especially in terms of integrating it in education. Obviously, that's something that's a big passion of yours. And one thing, the analogy I've been using is that I think in the very near future, whether it be advanced level research or even just like basic, English composition, I think where the prospects of artificial intelligence are really, really powerful, right? And the analogy I use is that of a calculator in STEM and math, right? Whereas one of the competencies of advanced math classes and science classes is how to use the calculator. I think in the near future, artificial intelligence will be that. The concern has been about cheating and stuff like that, but I think eventually once teachers and the education system is able to incorporate a way to embrace artificial intelligence, this will do great things for our students eventually. So just food for
thought. I appreciate that.
Of course. Anything else you'd like to mention by way of closing out?
No, just had a good time. Thank you for asking me to do this. I'm glad that we were able to get this done today, and just hope that everyone who hears this is registered to vote. And if they're not, they should do so. But if they are, they should go find 5 people who aren't and register those people and make sure that they all vote. Yeah, everyone in your house, your neighbors, your friends, make sure and vote.
Cool.
Yeah, that's all.
Well, thank you very much,
Yes,
Representative Menz.
thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.